Hello, everybody. I'm CheeseSlice, and I am here this fine Thursday morning, the first Thursday of 2025. And we are going to do two recordings we're going to record two segments for Left on Left, which is going to air on WBAI in New York and the Progressive Radio Network. And here's our host for today. It's Gloria Guillo. And hi, Gloria. She's going to be sitting in for Pasta once again. And we are going to have a conversation with Pasta to see how we're going to move forward soon with this show. And also we have with us Jayme Kuzmarov, the professor from Oklahoma Community College, or is it Tulsa Community College or Oklahoma Community College? Tulsa Community College in Oklahoma. All right. So are we ready? Oh, well, let's say everybody knows at home. So you know at home, we are going to be talking about Jimmy Carter and whether or not he was truly the peacemaker that media is claiming he is. That's going to be the first segment. Second segment is going to be a look back at January 6th. And was this or wasn't it a Fedsurrection? Is that the word you used to describe it, right. Gloria?
Yeah.
All right. Anyway, I'm going to step out. Gloria's going to take away the show. So let's do this. Here we go.
Hey, everyone. Welcome to Left on Left, where the left critiques itself and laughs out loud to keep from crying. I'm Gloria Guillo, filling in for Craig Pasta Jardula. I'm a former administrator in New York City government, an investigative journalist, vice chair at WBAI Radio, and a co-founder of Green Renaissance Sovereign Rights Movement, a group so left it's right on. I'm joined here today by a resident expert, Jayme Kuzmarov. Jayme is a professor at Tulsa Community College, historian, investigative journalist, and managing editor of Covert Action Magazine, an online magazine that focuses on CIA and deep state activity. Our producer and engineer is Jayme CheeseSlice. The opinions you hear represent our own and not those of WBAI, the Pacifica Foundation, or the Progressive Radio Network. Our topic today is on Jimmy Carter. While we are told it's impolite to speak ill of the dead, we believe perpetuating lies that prop up a murderous system is far worse. Jimmy Carter, the longest-lived American president, died at the age of 100 on December 29th in his hometown, Plains, Georgia. He won the presidency in the wake of the Watergate scandal and Vietnam War and served from 1977 to 1981. Carter's presidency was considered tumultuous due to an energy crisis involving fuel oil shortages that resulted in the rationing of gas and was defined by long lines at the pumps and high prices. Stagflation, a word that was invented in his service in office, which basically resulted in mortgage interest rates soaring from 9 to 17%, making home ownership exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, for the middle class. Carter's inability to negotiate the release of 53 American hostages held in Iran for approximately 2 years led to Ronald Reagan's successful election. Yet, Carter's presidency, which is considered tumultuous by most, is rebranded and sugar-coated with the patina of him being a great peacemaker in office and then after his term. Professor Kuzmarov would like to dispel this myth based on Carter's foreign policy and set the record straight. This is not done to disparage Carter, but to preserve the integrity of history. Take it away, Jayme.
Well, yeah, and on the last point, yeah, it's not disparaging him. In fact, he displayed a lot of the admirable qualities, particularly in his post-presidency, where he did far, far more than any other post-president to promote peace. And he often criticized U.S. foreign policies, like in the Middle East and elsewhere. And his Carter Center, was very fair. Like they say, for instance, they acknowledged that the election in Venezuela were very fair. And then they said that that was among the fairest elections in the world. And that was a country targeted by the United States for regime change. So, he spoke truth to power, but that was only when he was out of office. And it's a good example. It's a good education for people looking at his career, in that it's really not the person, it's a system, as you were emphasizing in the last episode, Gloria, and just now with your introduction. It's the system that produces these abhorrent policies. And politicians come and go, and most of them are charlatans and just pure opportunists, who are willing to lie every day. But there are a few decent people in there who have a conscience, but they can't do much in that system. They're under too much pressure when they're president and or in positions of power. And the only way they can get there is by closing up to large corporations who finance their campaigns. And Carter's no different. He came up in the state of Georgia with strong backing from Coca-Cola and Lockheed Martin, and he even flew in a Lockheed plane during his campaigns. And it's a very different Jimmy Carter, in the 60s and 70s. In the 60s, he was for the Vietnam War, and he had a campaign, in Georgia when he was the governor, honk for William Calley, because William Calley was the soldier, who was perpetrated the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, where over 450 Vietnamese civilians were killed. And this became a conservative cause to champion Calley, that, these liberals are out to smear an American patriot, because after Seymour Hersh exposed that he was involved in the My Lai massacre, the anti-war movement rallied around that as a way to end the war, that the war should be ended. So conservative, like today, the Trump conservative defend this guy Eddie Gallagher as a hero. He's a war criminal who killed Iraqi civilians. And it's the same as with Calley. So Carter was spearheading that campaign. He supported this campaign to honk for Calley. And then, my article looks at his president. So, he was a conservative Democrat. He was a conservative wing of the party. He was not, there was a liberal wing of the Democrats at that time that we've discussed on the show, who really were trying to end the Vietnam War, were against it, trying to abolish the CIA with the church hearings and figures like Leo Ryan in the party. But Carter was not of that wing of the party, and that's how he became elevated to gain the nomination in '76. And he was tied in with the Trilateral Commission, which was set up by the Rockefellers, and Zbigniew Brzezinski was a key figure in that, to try and revitalize American military power after the end of the Vietnam War and forge a trilateral world order with the U.S. at the head, as well as Japan and Germany. So that was a very elitist project, and they were very disdainful of the 60s New Left movement, which Brzezinski called an infantile disorder. And Carter was disparaging the anti-war movement at that time that wanted to change U.S. foreign policy in a more peaceful direction. George McGovern, 72, had a campaign on the platform "Come Home, America," and they wanted to, remove U.S. military bases overseas, restore America as a republic, and adopt more progressive domestic policies. But the Trilateral Commission disparaged the 60s New Left movement and sought to revitalize U.S. military power. And one thing I go into in the article is that once he was president, in accord with the wishes of the Trilateral Commission, Carter reoriented the U.S. military toward high-tech weapon systems and he invested very heavily with Harold Brown at the head of the Pentagon in these new systems like laser guided bombs and making use of computers. And this was a way to wage future wars without having to restore the draft, because it was recognized by the architects of U.S. empire that the U.S. couldn't, didn't have the support of the majority of the population anymore because of what had happened in Vietnam and the huge Vietnam anti-war movement and the awakening of that generation to the realities of U.S. foreign policy that had been displayed in Vietnam. So they had to find a way to fight wars without revitalizing the draft, and that meant relying on more high technology and advanced weapon systems, ultimately drone. They invested very heavily in drone development. So that Carter invested heavily in his presidency, and that set the groundwork for the wars we've seen in the future: the first Gulf War, the second Gulf War, and the wars today, which they wage without the support of the majority of the population and without having to enlist young men to fight. But that's a very sinister strategy. I mean, an alternative would have been simply to end the U.S. empire and adopt a more humanistic foreign policy and devote resources toward bettering the United States itself. But they didn't want to do that. There's too much money to be made in empire. So Carter served the power elite, so to speak, and adopted. And I go in more detail in my article as far as other policies he developed that were very negative, which we can discuss.
Jayme, I just want to say maybe Jayme could put up your article. It's called "Jimmy Carter Was Not a Peacemaker When He Was President, Only After." And this is upcoming. Jayme, when is this going to appear in Covert Action?
This will be published next week in Covert Action, and I published an academic article in the journal Race, Class, and Corporate Power about 6 or 7 years ago on Carter and his support for the revolution in military affairs, what I was just discussing, and the limits of the American two-party system. And this is often ignored by even academic historians who look at Carter's presidency. They ignore this. And Carter enacted at the time, he pledged, and this is why Americans don't trust their politicians, because the mood in the country in '76, there was a lot of anger about the Vietnam War, and there was this huge peace movement that emerged, and there were calls to cut the military budget significantly. And Carter promised to cut the budget in the campaign, but then 2 years into his presidency, he enacted the largest peacetime military buildup in United States history at that point. And a lot of that was this investment in this high technology that led to the development of drones and precision guided and laser guided bombs and missiles and other computerized systems whose purpose in part was to distance the public from the war that could be waged. Now, a lot of these systems actually don't work that well, like laser guided are not so precise. There's still many accidents and misfiring of targets and civilians that get killed. So it's an illusion that war can be waged cleanly. Those who promote this so-called revolution in military affairs, which occurred in the wake of the Vietnam War, subscribe to that illusion of a clean war. And we see that play out in modern day conflicts where so many civilians are killed.
Well, one thing I'd really like you to talk about is the Mujahideen and Afghan, and how that was really a Afghanistan, and how that was really the beginning of Islamic terrorism, and how that came about.
Absolutely, yeah. See, Carter appointed Zbigniew Brzezinski as his top national security advisor, who's an ardent Russophobe, and Brzezinski wanted to create an Islamic arch in the Middle East as a barrier against socialist and pro-Soviet governments in the Middle East. And in Afghanistan, you had a socialist revolution in 1973, and a pro-Soviet government that came to power. And there were a lot of benefits that government brought for the Afghan population by investing in economic development, promoting women's rights. But the Brzezinski idea was to arm Islamic fundamentalists. Traditional Islamists opposed the secular socialist government. And so the Brzezinski strategy was to arm the most fanatical, hardline Islamists to induce a Soviet invasion that would contribute to the demise of the Soviet Empire by drawing them into a quagmire in Afghanistan. And it's the same strategy applied in Ukraine today. And after years later, before he died, Brzezinski gave an interview, and he was asked about it, and he said, "Oh yeah, this was the greatest thing in the world. We led to the demise of the Soviet Empire." And the interviewer asked, "But what about Islamic terrorism that you helped unleash?" And Brzezinski said, "Oh, what's a few stirred up Muslim compared to the defeat of the Soviet Empire?" But I mean, after 9/11, a lot of people thought that this was horrible. I mean, because the U.S. had armed the most extreme Muslim fundamentalists, including this guy named Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. And the CIA later said, "Why did you arm this guy?" They said, "Well, because he was known for throwing acid in the face of women who didn't wear the veil, and he was just a real extremist and murderer." And they said, "Why do you support him?" He said, "Well, we thought he'd take the war into Central Asia and could fight the Soviets directly." So these are just like fanatics who wanted to fight the Russians, take them on directly, and would arm the most extreme terrorist fanatics. And this is the origin of Al Qaeda and a lot of the tumult in the Middle East and violence we've seen in the Middle East. And most people with a sober mindset today would say this was not a smart thing to do at all. And there was no concern for the Afghan population. That the Soviet years of Soviet warfare just destroyed that society, killed tens of thousands of people, destroyed the fabric of their society, and fueled more extremism within Afghanistan, and would lead to future wars. So this is just a harebrained scheme with disastrous human consequences. And Carter deserved the blame, and he appointed Brzezinski, and they were close from the beginning with the Trilateral Commission. And Brzezinski was a bright intellectual. He's a Kissinger type, but he wrote these screeds railing against the New Left and anti-Vietnam War movement, and he's a pure political reactionary.
One thing, other thing that you put in your article, and that I've experienced firsthand, is this whole concept of humanitarian aid and how it's really fungible and it becomes military aid very easily. And when it is humanitarian aid, it's also used to try for regime change and to kind of pry open a country and make way for the IMF and all kinds of things that will actually control the economy. So it's really not very humanitarian. And we've talked a lot about NED, National Endowment of Democracy, and how that's also used in that way. So could you talk a little bit about the fungibility of humanitarian aid?
Yeah, well, Carter
so-called.
was a very pivotal presidency in creating this concept of humanitarian intervention and co-opting the human rights movements of the 60s and early 70s, which their initial focus was on U.S. foreign policy, on the horrible human rights abuses that were occurring in the Vietnam War, which they wanted to end. And part of it was the Phoenix program, which we've discussed on this show, and the horrific prison abuses, like at the Con Son prison run by the USAID's Office of Public Safety as part of the Phoenix Project, where they were arresting all these alleged Viet Cong and putting them in these horrible prisons where they're kept in underground cages known as the Tiger Cages. So the human rights groups and human rights organizations like Amnesty focused a lot on that in the 60s and early 70s. But then Carter came along with this rhetoric of human rights, but he was focused on U.S. adversary like Russia, the horrible human rights abuses going on in Russia, and we have to counteract that. So that's how it got spun around. I mean, Carter did cut military aid to a few governments in Latin America that were implicated in the Operation Condor. It was a CIA operation basically of torture and murder targeting leftists, like in Argentina and Chile. Carter did cut aid to a few of those governments, but studies of his human rights policy showed he maintained aid to some of the worst human rights abusers in the world. That 75, I think I had the statistic in my article, that 75% of U.S. security aid under Carter went to regimes that had terrible human rights records and dictatorships. And a lot of by the end of his presidency, he was using human rights as a cudgel against American enemies like the Soviet Union and communist regimes like Vietnam. He started demonizing the Vietnamese communist government, and his administration even supported the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, which was a genocidal regime that came into power as a result of the disarray caused by the U.S. bombing of Cambodia. And then Vietnam invaded Cambodia to liberate the country from the Khmer Rouge, the Vietnamese communists, and Carter supported the Khmer Rouge, and he was demonizing Vietnam, and they imposed a harsh embargo on Vietnam that compounded the ravaging economic effects of the Vietnam War. And that's the sanction policy we've discussed that has horrible human rights ramifications. So, I mean, there was such a blatant double standard of his human rights foreign policy. And then again, he's spinning it around to lend support for military intervention. And Noam Chomsky compared him to John Kennedy, who did the same thing. He had this kind of flowery rhetoric, and he captured this. It's very dangerous because it captures the support of liberals who would oppose a conservative or would oppose a Vietnam War. But when you have a Kennedy type figure or Carter with this nice human rights rhetoric, they rally behind him and they end up supporting the pernicious goals of U.S. foreign policy.
It's really surprising you brought up the Carter Center. And I don't think he's had such a big role in the Carter Center in his later years. But while the Carter Center, as you stated, supported the electoral system in Venezuela and considered it one of the best in the world, I was in Venezuela covering the election, and they had very negative things to say about, actually, they had things to say before the election even took place. It was really crazy with the Carter Center. And the Lawyers Guild, the National Lawyers Guild, had representatives there with me and other people. There was a tremendous amount of, I think there was about 1,000 election observers. And they brought out the fact that the Carter Center has really been weaponized by the State Department. And it no longer is really a kind of an independent body, if it ever really was. But certainly at this point it isn't. And it's really a part of the State Department's disinformation campaigns. So, we're in the election integrity world, we're pretty cautious about the Carter Center now. So I don't know how much, influence Jimmy Carter had in his last few years, but, that's kind of where it is. I mean, you also talked about a couple of things that he did get right, which was Camp David and also the SALT Treaty.
Well, yeah, and if I want to discuss Carter and the CIA with the time we have, but yeah, well, with Camp David, I mean, that was really, that's one of these things. It's heralded in the media. He was this great peacemaker, but that was really they excluded the Palestinians. I put in a footnote that they excluded the Palestinians from those talks, and really the Israeli government wanted to shore up an agreement with Egypt so they can turn their focus on crushing the Palestinians. So that really wasn't such a great agreement, certainly from the Palestinian point of view. And SALT too, I mean, that was fine. I would advocate for restoring these kind of arms control treaties, but it was really very minor. In fact, Carter really he revitalized the Cold War after Vietnam. And most historians, including the Pentagon's own historian, argues for a much stronger continuity from Carter to Reagan than most people think, because Carter enacted this huge military buildup. He enacted the Carter Doctrine in the Middle East, which was designed to keep the Soviets out of the Middle East, which was a major escalation of U.S. military presence and U.S. military bases in the Middle East. He used human rights as a cudgel against the Soviet Union, and he adopted this strong Cold War rhetoric against the Soviet Union that Reagan picked up and expanded further. And also he initiated a lot of a covert operation like in Central America that set the groundwork for the Contra War. He authorized a huge covert operation to try and undermine the socialist Sandinista government that took over in 1979 after overthrowing the U.S. client Anastasio Somoza. And with regard to the CIA, I have a section in my article on that. He gains credit because, in the wake of the Church Committee, there were a lot of people in the Democratic Party calling for the abolition of the CIA. Now, Carter was a consummate politician. I think we should understand how politicians operate, and Carter was no different, and neither was Kennedy. There's some on the left who have this glorified view of Kennedy and some Carter, but they're no different. They're just politicians. They make deals. And what he did was he appeased that faction of the Democrats by purging about 800 CIA covert officers. Some were involved in black operations, but really that was designed to save the agency. He appointed Stansfield Turner, who was his friend from the Naval Academy, to head the CIA, and Turner appointed Frank Carlucci as his deputy. Frank Carlucci was a hardline Cold Warrior who was involved in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. And then he passed, Turner championed this legislation basically that made it harder to leak information and expose CIA operations. So he was really protecting the agency. He rooted out some people to make it look like, to appease that faction of the party that wanted to abolish it. But he saved it. He did that to save the agency and its reputation. It's like what you call limited hangout or damage control. Then he appoints Carlucci, and then Turner is basically quashing any legislation that would expose or provide more oversight of the CIA. And then Turner was involved with the theft of the Promise software, which was this computer software that the CIA would use in future years for money laundering operations, and made it easier to move money around in banks and hide what they're doing. So that was all to the benefit of the CIA. And in his obituary, when Turner died, the New York Times said, he sanctioned all these covert operations in Russia and in Eastern Europe, and also in Latin America with the Sandinistas. He set the groundwork for the Iran-Contra affair. So Carter really helped save the CIA and revitalize its operations, and that's a myth about him, that he challenged the CIA. Although there were elements in the CIA against him. The hardliners coordinated the October surprise. They deliberately, they basically blackmailed the Iranian government to withhold the release of the hostages so that Carter would look bad and Reagan could be elected.
Yeah, I just have to say, they released the hostages on January 21st.
Yeah.
I mean, come on.
And so the hardliners still plotted against Carter, but really, and got in Reagan, who was much more of a Rambo type cowboy. But overall, to conclude, Carter really set the groundwork for a lot of Reagan's policies. And that's true in domestic affairs as well. New studies are coming out, like by David Gibbs, called Revolt of the Rich, that shows how Carter was the first neoliberal president. He deregulated the banking structure. He promoted right-to-work legislation. He went against labor unions. He promoted economic austerity. He appointed Paul Volcker, the head of the Federal Reserve, who was an ardent conservative. So he should be viewed as, and again, in general, if you study U.S. politics, you see a lot more continuity. That's why the two-party system is really a sham. It's one uniparty enacting the same kind of policy that favor the rich and advance the warfare state. And that's why we need independent grassroots movements and new parties to challenge that oligarchy.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. Wow. So that wraps up our show for today. This is Left on Left. I'm Gloria Guillo, joined by Professor Jayme Kuzmarov. Remember to like, donate, and share our broadcast. Your kind support keeps us going. Thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you next week.
Okay.
All right, I had to mute something before I came on. All right, so that's one in the
One in the
first
can.
one about Jimmy Carter. Yeah, one in the can. And the next one we've got coming up is about January 6th. Was it real or a Fedsurrection? So take it away, Gloria. Oh wait, let me reset. Reset the clock. Okay, now I'm ready. So take it away, Gloria.
Hey everyone, welcome to Left on Left, where the left critiques itself and laughs out loud to keep from crying. I'm Gloria Guillo, filling in for Craig Pasta-Jardula. I'm a former administrator in New York City government and investigative journalist, vice chair at WBAI Radio, and a co-founder of Green Renaissance Sovereign Rights Movement, a group so left it's right on. I'm joined here today by a resident expert, Jayme Kuzmarov. Jayme is a professor at Tulsa Community College, a historian, investigative journalist, and managing editor of Covert Action Magazine, an online magazine that focuses on CIA and deep state activity. Our producer and engineer is Jayme CheeseSlice. The opinions you hear represent our own and not those of WBAI, the Pacifica Foundation, or the Progressive Radio Network. Our topic for today was the January 6th Capitol riots a coup or a Fedsurrection? And this is based on an article that Jayme Kuzmarov had written, and it was published in Covert Action Magazine on May 23rd. And the title is so big, I really don't have to do an introduction, just read the title. So here we go. There are two narratives on the January 6th Capitol riots. The left calls it a fascist coup attempt. The right calls it a Fedsurrection. Which narrative is correct, or are they both? Take it away, Jayme.
Well, in this case, and I don't know if Gloria, you agree with me or not, I think there's, in a way, both narratives have some truth to it. And both may be also exaggerated. So we can deconstruct each one. I mean, as far as the coup, well, firstly, if it was a coup, it was a very amateurish and failed coup. I mean, I don't think it was a coup. On one hand, I do think that there was an operation. There's a book, I forget the author now off the top of my head. I have it in the article. That does expose an operation by the Trump campaign to try and delegitimize the election, and perhaps some kind of plan where Trump would come back into the presidency. I mean, clearly there was some coordination among pro-Trump groups to get these people out there. I mean, some people were legitimately questioning of this election result, as well as others. We know there are problems with every American election. But clearly there was manipulation by the campaign, the Trump campaign, an attempt to get these people there and to cause a ruckus. But if it was a coup, Trump would have been more directly involved in trying to coordinate it. And I mean, it wasn't very violent. I mean, a lot of those people are supposed gun nuts who support Trump, but not many brought guns with them. I don't think there were any or very few guns there, and they really didn't use violence. Now, as far as we know there were provocateurs in the crowd. This has come to light. There was this figure, Ray Epps, who was a key person in stirring up the rioters. And, there's a famous video that captured him whispering in the ear of this guy named Ryan Samsel. And they're the ones who push down the barricade and kind of go to the crowd into the Capitol building. So that would be evidence of manipulation behind it. We now know there are a huge number of FBI infiltrators and provocateurs within the January 6th. There are a lot of video. Revolver News is a conservative website, and I generally don't agree with a lot of what they write about, but I thought they had very good coverage of the January 6th and reporting about some of the oddities. And they had videos like there was a fence cutter who was there, and it's like the place is surrounded by feds and police. Why aren't they stopping this guy? He was cutting the fences, and they didn't stop him. And there's another guy, Scaffold Man, who was he was arranging it basically to provoke people to enter in the Capitol, and they weren't stopping these guys. So they're clear provocateur, and law enforcement wasn't stopping them. And then the Ray Epps, who is he has a background in the military. And what was shady about him is that he was never prosecuted. They gave some people huge prison sentences, and yet here's the guy who's a key person who pushes over the fence and is urging the crowd stirring the crowd and getting them to move into the Capitol building. and yet he faced no prosecution. He never faced any jail time. He was initially on the FBI most wanted list, but then they took him off the list. And I think he got like a suspended sentence of 6 months or something, when others got 20 years, and he was clearly a key figure. And then that guy Samsel, who pushed over the fence, was horribly beaten in prison, which makes you suspicious if you watched enough movies that they beat, or threatening him in prison not to talk or something. It looks pretty bad. And then there's all these strange deaths. They claim that the rioters beat police to death, like Brian Sicknick, but then it was later reported that he died of a stroke later that day, which was odd because he was a man in his early 40s who was otherwise healthy, who suddenly dies of a stroke. And then there are a couple other deaths that were very suspicious, like a woman, Roseanne Boylan. They claim she had a drug overdose in the middle of the riot. But her family said she had been off drugs for years, and she looked very healthy in the photo. There were a video of her. So anyway, it had the appearance that there was manipulation to make this look a lot worse.
Well, one of the things with manipulation that we've discussed is the video footage. The video footage was really altered in a way that they showed us video footage of, and they'd add a soundtrack to it, or that didn't really belong to it. So we've seen video footage that was suppressed, and that video footage showed basically the police giving a tour of the Capitol building to the people who got in. So it's really quite interesting. And there's ones of Jake Chansley, who was the guy with the horns, and there's video footage of them basically opening doors for him, leading him around the chambers, and then leading him out. And it's really quite interesting because that footage was not released. The footage that was released was these fence scenes and these breaking through scenes. So we really didn't get a representative picture of what was going on. We really got a representation of what they wanted us to believe, that it was a riot. And there were some interesting things that were going on too, with Nancy Pelosi. Just so happened to have her daughter there, who was a filmmaker. There was also Nancy Pelosi refusing to allow the National Guard to come after Trump had asked for, I think, how many troops was it, Jeremy? Like 10,000 or something like that. There's a lot of troops.
That is a big question. Yeah, the role of the police and why the National Guard was not deployed much earlier when they knew there were huge crowds and there was a potential for danger. And there are a lot of question marks about that. And you can ask what would be the motive if the media played this up or deliberately allowed this to go on. The police let them in the building. What's the motive? And my conclusion in my article is that this was part of a strategy of tension, that they just want to create divisions in the oligarchy, people who really run the show. They want to create divisions in society, create hatred on the left for the right, to make like and to play up this threat of domestic violence extremism, so they could push through yet more draconian legislation, like anti-terrorism bills. And we saw in the aftermath of January 6th, and this is how you know it's a deep event. And those who study these events, going back to, for instance, Peter Dale Scott looked at the Kennedy assassination, like right after Robert Kennedy was assassinated, they passed all this new legislation to bolster police powers. And after the Oklahoma City bombing. Usually there's a pattern, and you saw that here, is that right after they passed all this new draconian legislation to empower the police, to provide more money for the police. So that would fit the pattern, that they play this up. They kind of manufacture these incidents or stir up. Maybe there was something already going to happen, but they pushed it over the edge, or they made sure or made it seem much worse than it was, and had these provocateurs to make it worse, much worse than it would have been. And this is to put the public on edge. The public watches this and is horrified. American democracy is under threat. And yes, they're willing to sign away their civil liberties and sign away their tax dollars away from the social programs like we discussed on the show where it's needed, education, healthcare, but instead to bolster the police even more. And it turns out the people on the January 6th committee, the Democrat Benny Thompson, gets a lot of money from military contractors who have a contract with the Department of Homeland Security for X-ray screening and stuff like that. Companies that do the screening. So these are the companies that benefit because more and more money is going into Homeland Security, FBI, and there were legislation passed to give them more money, as well as the local police forces. And then the saga with these FBI whistleblowers came forward saying that they were exaggerating. They tried to report bad FBI practices, how they were misreporting things and they were exaggerating the arrests for domestic violence extremism, what the Biden administration called, and they were deliberately playing up this domestic terrorism threat. And this would fit into the plan to play up this threat. I mean, that's what they do. They're going to play up the threat from Russia, from China. The war on terror, the threat of Islamic terrorism. And now we're in a time where the people are tired of the war on terror. There hasn't been any Islamic terrorist attacks on American soil for decades now. So how can they justify spending all that money on counterterrorism? So they have to manufacture a terrorism threat. So it has to come from within, and it's these white supremacist domestic extremists. And I mean, these groups do exist, and some are pernicious, but they had to manufacture this kind of incident to make it seem like a real threat to American democracy, and that's how they're going to pass this legislation. And I think those FBI whistleblowers are very key, who testified before Congress about how they were playing up this threat of domestic violence extremism.
I think very important point that you had made is also just taking a look at how this really deflected the American public for legitimately looking at what was going on with the voting irregularities. And there were many, just taking everybody back. This was the point where you had the COVID narrative, and mail-in ballots were encouraged, and voting was multiple days. And I've done a lot of election integrity in different countries. And one of the things we like to see when you're looking at election integrity is that you have one person, one vote, one day, and the machines are not hooked up to the internet. There's a chain of custody for all the votes. And a lot of these things really didn't happen. And when we looked at kind of the pattern of voting for Democrats over the last several elections, we saw that usually there are about 60 million. And it just so happens that it spiked to 80 million in the election between Biden and Trump. So everyone, and then it's now back down to 60 million again. So everybody is like, where did these 20 million votes come from? And a lot of people were saying they were coming, that they had no chain of custody. They were just showing up and being counted. So, if you hook up to the internet, you have proprietary secret software. Things can happen on the front end with the votes, and they can happen on the back end with the electronic system. So there really is a lot to question in the American voting system. And that was shut down because everyone who is an election integrity person was all of a sudden a right-wing extremist, as opposed to just wanting to get to the truth and understand our voting system and what's going on.
Good point. Excellent. Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on the voting system, but I think you make some very valid points. And this has to be debated and discussed. But yeah, they stifled any debate. And there has to be more investigation so the facts could fully come to light. But this was prevented because all the attention, you're right, was put on this alleged riot, and that would use to discredit this cause as just some right-wing cause. And that's a pattern we've seen in recent years. Like even the COVID, people who question the COVID narrative were called right-wing extremists. That they've been doing that. I think the Clintons started that pattern. Anybody who questioned the Clintons and a lot of their corruption was allegedly part of this vast right-wing machine that was against them. And anytime there was an investigation because there was this guy, Richard Mellon Scaife, who was this billionaire who hated the Clintons, who did fund some investigations into the Clintons' corruption. And if you talk to liberals or even in intellectual circles, academia, you can't discuss this stuff. They say, "Oh, that's Richard Mellon's," because I did a whole book on the Clintons, and my book was attacked in an academic journal recently. And he's like, "Oh, this was just these right-wing studies that he's citing, and it's this billionaire who hated the Clintons." But I mean, look, everybody has to get their funding from somewhere. It doesn't mean that if they've actually done the legwork and done the research and uncovered things, then you have to acknowledge what they were uncovering. Even there might be some agenda. I mean, there's an agenda behind any academic research. It has to get its funding somewhere. So anyway, I'm just making that that's a pattern now, is that they used to call them left-wing extremists. Back in the day, somebody would investigate the CIA and the Phoenix Project, and they say, "Oh, he's a left-wing extremist. We can't accept what he says." And now they just say, "Oh, he's a right-wing extremist." Whatever the issue is, whether it's the corruption of the Clintons, election integrity, COVID-19, 9/11, whatever it is, political assassination.
I think you also tied this into the Oklahoma City bombing. Do you want to show that parallel too?
Yeah, and I think this is something people on the left are very weak on and need to recognize that the FBI, just because you don't like right-wing groups, and you may have very, very good reason not to like them, but that it doesn't mean that it's a good thing if the FBI infiltrates these groups, because they have the FBI and deep state have their own agenda. And I mean, they're smart. Look, under COINTELPRO, they infiltrated the left, and the left was stronger. I mean, the goal was to destroy the left, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and they succeeded. Now the left is very weak, and the right is much stronger. So they're going to infiltrate and co-opt those groups for their own agenda too, and it's not a good thing for anybody, because it's really part of what I discussed in both cases. It's a strategy of tension. They want to create dramatic incidents or criminal or terrorist acts that will put the public on edge and lend to suspending of rational judgment and allow them to pass draconian police state measures and really to destroy what's left of American democracy. So people on the left should be as weary of FBI and CIA or deep state infiltration of the right and covert action involving right-wing groups as much as left-wing groups. Even if they don't sympathize with those groups, there's a broader agenda that's detrimental to democracy that people should acknowledge. And now with regard, and it's documented that the FBI does this, including in government studies. So this is not a conspiracy theory. And with January 6th, we have the evidence. They've admitted to dozens of infiltrators. Now, as far as Oklahoma City, yeah, we can perhaps.
Wait, before you jump there, I just wanted to, because you brought up some other things. Enrique Tarrio, do you just want to talk about him just for a minute? This is a FBI informant that got 22 years, sentenced to 22 years, and he was not even there at the time. Do you think it's possible that he was sentenced to 22 years to shut him up and to keep him from talking?
I can't comment on this case. I don't know enough about it, but I know it's an egregious double standard with Ray Epps, who's clearly, he was there and he was stirring on the crowd and he was caught on video, and he's even admitted that was him on 60 Minutes, and yet he got no jail time. So, I mean, there's a huge dichotomy there that anybody with a functioning brain has to start asking critical questions. And, Oklahoma City, we can do a whole show. The 30th anniversary is coming up in April, so tune in for our show. We'll do 2 segments on that. I can talk for a long time about that because I did a detailed study. I'll just make the basic points about it, is that it's documented that the white supremacist groups that were accused of carrying out the Oklahoma City bombing were infiltrated by the FBI and probably the CIA through a guy named Andreas Strassmeyer. And Timothy McVeigh himself had an Army background and special forces. and appears to have been a provocateur and a patsy, and that the federal government was involved in the Oklahoma City bombing. And that sets the pattern for January 6th, where they're infiltrating these right-wing groups, extremist groups like the Proud Boys, and they're, provocateur maybe the ones who are initiating these spectacular actions, like on January 6th. And the agenda would be to advance the interests of the so-called, deep state, and to promote police state measures in the country that the public would not otherwise support unless there was something dramatic that happened that puts them on edge and is fearful of violence. And all of a sudden they're willing to sign away cherished civil liberties. And that's a boon to the military police industrial complex. So I think there is a motive. It's a pernicious one, and people on the left should be weary of FBI infiltration of right-wing groups, even if we oppose those groups.
You also talked about Governor Whitmore and her kidnapping, and how that, I think, had more feds than it had other participants. Would you like to expand on that?
A state, and why should our government, our taxpayers, are funding crimes? So these FBI agents infiltrated, and they manipulate. FBI and CIA, they're good at manipulating people. They manipulated some down on their luck people, and maybe people of lower IQ, and got them to participate in this harebrained scheme to kidnap the governor. And it was all to play up this domestic terrorist threat. This was all driven by the FBI, and that sets another precedent for January 6th. So this doesn't come out of nowhere. These allegations of Fedsurrection and what we're learning about the FBI role, it's not occurring in a vacuum. It's happened many times before, and there's a clear pattern, and that's why we need systemic reform of the FBI. And we need more people to wake up on the left that this is going on. I mean, the left media and liberal media was totally silent about this, and they just totally wanted to blame Donald Trump for everything, and that's very limited. They're missing really what's going on in our society, and it's this Trump derangement syndrome. And again, we're not followers of Trump on this show. I agree with a lot of the critiques. I think Trump is a cancer on the American body politic and a horrible reactionary. But he's not the only problem in American political life. And getting rid of him is not going to solve these broader problem and broader sickness of our democracy and society. So people need to wake up to these broader phenomenon, and we need broader movements for change and reform of the system. And we need to be attuned to their tricks so we don't fall for it. We don't sign away our liberties and what's left of our democracy. And we don't sign away so much money to the police and FBI. They're already over fed with huge budgets when our schools are starving, when we don't have the health care, when we should be building high-speed rail. And that's where our priority in government should be. I mean, we want good police forces. I'm not a supporter of the defund the police. The police do play a vital function in society, whether it's solving murder, domestic violence cases. Those are very important. We need good national self-defense, but the budgets now are way out of whack. We don't need these over-militarized police forces, and a police state. We want to have a balance with good police, but respect for civil liberties, and not a militarized police. And that's something the founding fathers had warned about.
True. It's, even in the most, desperate communities, they want the police. It's who does the police work for? Does it work for the community? Or does it work for an elite group? And certainly if they're armed in military regalia and they're, given sound cannons and all kinds of really aggressive tanks, weapons that are really appropriate for a battlefield, it's a problem. So community policing, we're in favor of community policing.
Yeah, and what we're seeing here, that the police are committing crimes, whether on January 6th, whether the Michigan governor's plot, they were the one instigating these criminal acts, and that is wrong. We need oversight bodies to rein in the police force to ensure that they abide by the law and they set a good standard.
Well, I think we're coming to the end of our show, and that wraps it up for today. This is Left on Left. I'm Gloria Guillo, joined by Professor Jayme Kuzmarov. Remember to like, donate, and share our broadcast. Your kind support keeps us going. Thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you next week.
Great. All right, there we go.
Excellent
wrap for today. Good
All
job, guys.
I got to run because got stuff to do like all you guys. So, but yeah, great shows. And next week, should we plan for next Thursday again?
Yeah, I could do next Thursday.
Next Thursday will be the MK Ultra. So.
All right, my favorite topic.
Okay, we'll do 2 segments on that. So.
Oh
Sounds
boy,
good.
that's gonna be. That's a hot topic.
Yeah,
it's gonna be mind blowing.
Absolutely. All right, great show, Gloria.
Thanks, Jayme.
Take care, Jayme.
All right, take care.
See you soon. Thanks for all that you do.
Yeah, no problem. All right. Everybody's gone. It's just me. So I hope everybody had a good New Year's Eve. I celebrated with donuts and ice cream. And I have leftover donuts. And I think as soon as I finish up this stream, I am going to go eat one of those donuts because they're just going to go bad unless I eat them. So I probably should throw them out just so I don't eat them. But anyway, have a happy new year, everybody. And 2025, we're halfway through the decade, or this year will be halfway through the decade. By the end of it, I can't believe it. It just feels like the pandemic was a couple days ago. And hopefully things will turn around this year. On a foreign policy standpoint, I've got low expectations, but maybe on the domestic front, things will get better. So 2024 was a rough year for a lot of us, but we'll see how it goes. So let's thank Gloria and Jayme. And on behalf of Pasta, this is Pasta to Go. He should be returning to this show in the next couple weeks. We're going to have a chat about that. Anyway, I'm CheeseSlice. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.